So in this next segment, we've been talking a lot about lesson planning. If you watch the other segments, that's great. If you haven't, that's okay, because this one can stand alone. And I've planned some lessons with Benchmark, and the curriculum that we're using is Benchmark for planning. But this is really just a 4-pane quick lesson plan that you can do with any curriculum or with no curriculum at all if you're building your curriculum from the ground up. So I'm going to start just by talking about what should be in an ELD lesson so that we can frame our thinking for what we're going to do in that 30 minutes. And I also want us to think about the direct instruction lesson plan, because that's really the basis for this kind of lesson planning. And what we're going to do is we're going to languageize our lesson for that 30 minutes of ELD. So the first thing that just makes sense to me is a 4-pane, and this is really how I think about planning in my own ELD time. So I'm just going to make a quick 4-pane for each section of my lesson plan. But at the top here, I'm going to just make sure that I have a language objective. And that language objective, in the case of Benchmark, is going to come from my Benchmark ELD section. But I'm going to have to dig a little deeper than just saying, okay, this is what's written in the book, I'm going to put it right here. I'm really going to think about what language is required for that. Is it the language of adjectives or using adjectives? Is it looking at morphemes? Is it looking at description? Is it looking at identification or explaining or answering? And that's going to be my language objective. The easiest way to think about a language objective is to say, what's it going to sound like when the kids do it? And that's my objective. That's my measurable and my deliverable. The other thing I'm just going to remind myself of as a teacher is that my lesson should focus on either listening, speaking, reading, or writing. And ideally, it's going to have some form of at least 2 of those, like listening and speaking, or speaking and writing. When I got more comfortable with this kind of lesson planning, I tried to do all 3 in my lesson. So the question that I always get asked about that when I talk about that 30 minutes of designated ELD is, why leave out reading? And the answer is, because I'm a reading teacher, it's very easy for me to make that 30 minutes into a double reading group. And reading of all of the skills is the one that my kids can get on their own from free reading. Not get on their own completely, obviously they have to be taught how to read and how to read well and carefully, but they can get that fluency piece from independent reading at the reading level. And I want this 30 minutes to give me the most bang for my buck. So to do that, I'm going to focus on the things that they really can't get without me, without some good scaffolding and instruction. So my language objective is going to count as number 1, and the next thing I'm going to do, and I'm just checking my notes over here, so that's my 1, and then my 2 is going to be input and modeling. And my input and modeling here, I want to make sure that my kids are still with me with input and modeling. It's going to be more input than modeling. Because I don't want my kids just to see an example of what it looks like done well. I want my kids to be with me during this piece. So yes, it is input, but it's not input in the way that we would say input is lecture, or input is, I'm going to tell you what we're going to do. It's really more interactive with the kids. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about that input piece. Next, and Steve's just panning over here to my chart on the wall. 3 is going to be what I think of as guided practice, and we're going to call this structure and guidance. Okay, thank you, Steve. Structure and guidance. And I call this guided practice because I'm old. See, if I were in a room full of people, they would think that's funny, but because I'm alone with like 5 people, I'm not really old. Yes, I am old. But guided practice, I love the word guide because this really is guiding, but they're still on the journey with you. So if you're guiding a hike, you're not taking 2 steps and then having them take 2 steps. You're all walking together. So I want you to think of guidance here, not as you do it and then they do it and you do it and then they do it. That's input. Guidance is we're going to do this together. This is the team piece of me being a participant with the kids during this 30 minutes. And then number 4, my 4th piece I'm going to plan and do is actually that opportunity for interaction. And I'm just checking my notes here. And we called this independent practice because in the 5-step DII plan, or the DII plan, that's what it's called. And it is independent, and then the kids are doing it independently. But because this is ELD, they're not working alone. So I'm going to just put here in parentheses or in brackets that it's interaction, because I want to be clear there. Independent practice is not one kid working on their own independently. This means independent of me. So I'm just monitoring at this point. And then my last piece is my assessment and my closure. And I'm just going to check my note there. So I'm going to assess in 2 ways. The first one is throughout the lesson, I'm going to do checks for understanding. And good language research and theory tells us that those CFUs need to be pretty quick, like every minute or 2. And then I'm also going to assess at the end of my plan, and that's going to be for closure. And as you know from teaching, my closure is going to check to see where they are with my language objective, at the top here. And that's really critical for 2 reasons. The first is I want to know if my lesson was effective. The second is I want to know where they are in their language. So my CFU is what I just call an engagement check, making sure that kids are getting it and getting the concept. My closure piece is making sure that they got the larger objective. Are there times where they don't? Sure. And what that tells me is that language objective may be too high, it may be very complex, and if it's very complex, it may take more than one lesson for them to get it. So that assessment is really throughout the lesson. Now, this is the most important piece, I think, and that is that I have times on my lesson plan. So 50% of my lesson should be kids interacting with kids using the language I taught them. So if half my lesson is interaction, that's going to be 15 minutes. And you can kind of see the natural progression if we've got 4 panes. If input and modeling is important, if structure and guidance is important, and if assessment's important, then each of these are going to be equally important. We're going to make those 5 minutes each. So now my lesson is planned in that I've got this template to work with. I want to remind us of one more thing here with language objective. There are 2 kinds of language that we teach. The first one is function, and this is the why of language, or the what. So this is inform, explain, describe, argue, prove. It's the function, it's the reason we use language. And then I'm going to also focus on the form, and this is the what does it sound like. And I'm also going to add the how, or the how. So when I explain, what does it sound like when I explain? When I describe, what does it sound like? When I compare, my function is compare. What's the form? It's going to have both and as well as to, because that's the function, that's how I use language to compare. So that function and form, sometimes I have function and form in my language objective according to benchmark. Sometimes it's just form. Most often, if you're looking closely at benchmark, you're going to see both of those. If you're not using benchmark, you want to have both of those in every lesson. So here's the what, and then what does it sound like when you do that. If you'd like an example of a lesson that does that with function and form, you can go back in this series and watch the video with the 3rd grade class where we looked at the language that went along with this location description. So the function was where, describing where for location, and then the form was using in, on, at, different places, physical locations. So I think the most important thing is sometimes we can get caught up in, is that how specific do we want to be with form? When we talk about location, do we want to talk about only locations that are on top of things or under or beside? And the key there is really we're looking at natural language. Teaching kids how to describe location is a very broad thing. So if we've got kids using language 50% of the time with a language objective that says location, we're going to be doing well, and we're going to get kids really using language. So don't get too caught up in the specificity of the function. It's really the form that we're after. What does it sound like when kids do it? I'm going to turn to my audience of experts here, and I'm going to just ask if there are any questions or anything that I can clarify about the 4 pane here. We'll call it the 4.2 pane, right? Because that language objective's at the top.
Is it okay if your designated ELD objective does not match your objective for the lesson in ELA that day?
Okay, so one of the questions that comes up a lot is how closely does my designated ELD lesson have to match my designated ELA lesson? And my answer is when you give kids language, they can use it in every context, they can use it all day. So what I want to be really careful of in my designated ELD, and I'm speaking here from my personal journey for designated ELD, is that I wanted to front load my kids for my ELA lesson, or I wanted to clean up any problems I saw during my ELA lesson. And it took me a long time to figure out I wasn't moving kids as quickly as I wanted to. And that's because they were getting a double dose of literacy instead of getting language that they needed. So does your ELD lesson have to match your ELA lesson specifically? The answer is no, because language is so broadly given and so broadly learned that they don't have to match exactly. I always like to teach an ELD lesson after I've taught the ELA lesson, simply because then I have something to talk about with the kids, and that's actually what we did in the 3rd grade lesson in this series. So the kids already had a content that they talked about, St. Augustine, Florida, and then I was able to build on that because we had a common vocabulary for that. What it wasn't was more reading time. It was simply more language based on a topic that they knew about. So does the ELD lesson have to match the ELA lesson? It does not, because we're never going to be able to exactly match language anyway. Anytime we grow in language, we grow in all language. So that's why when someone says, I want to learn French, and we say go to France, it doesn't really matter the specifics of how they learn the French. What matters most is that they use it. So it does not have to match exactly. Any other questions? Fake or real?